Sometimes history seems to whisper more than it shows. And when that happens, something within us awakens like an ancient memory, as if the soul recognized a sign that the eyes still do not understand. Tell me, have you ever had the feeling that certain marks left in time were not made just to be seen but to be remembered? Abydos is that kind of place, a temple that breathes more silence than stone, more secret than dust. And if you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is exactly what you needed to hear. Because some inscriptions found there, they do not just belong to Egypt. They belong to a space between history and the impossible, a portal where symbols become questions and questions become paths. There are those who say that everything is nothing more than erosion, superimposition of hieroglyphs, natural faults of time. But there are also those who, faced with the shapes carved on the walls of Seti, feel a shiver that isn't fear, it's recognition, as if the past carries echoes of something that humanity has not yet dared to decipher. When I look at Abydos, I don't just see art. I see intention. I see precision. I see something that seems to have been left there to be found just now, in an era where technology makes us question what is truly modern and what is perhaps just souvenir of a forgotten era. And so we began our journey, between light and sand, between science and myth, between what we believe we know and what we still fear to discover. Because sometimes, to understand the future, we need to go back to the wall where everything started. Abydos is not just an ancient temple, it is an archive carved in stone, a memory geology that insists on staying awake. When the first explorers moderns walked through its worn columns, they were not prepared for what would find on the ceiling of the temple of Seti. There, among familiar cartouches and symbols, there were ways that didn't seem to fit into any accepted timeline. Outline one resembled a helicopter, another resembled an armored vehicle, and yet another resembled a stylized submarine. It didn't matter how skeptical the observer was. The impact was always the same. A silence. A long silence. Something there didn't fit with the world that the story describes. Archaeologists called these inscriptions palimpsest, suggesting that layers ancient hieroglyphs would have been carved, erased, and recarved along the dynasties, creating accidental forms. According to this explanation, the helicopter would be the overlapping of two symbols disfigured by time. The tank would just be erosion, and the submarine would be nothing more than a visual coincidence. It was the official, elegant, and comfortable. But something remains in the air when the explanation seems to solve the riddle too fast. After all, coincidences rarely align in three distinct ways, in the same space, with such defined proportions. And this opens up space for a question that bothers. Is chance really that precise? For many visitors, the effect is immediate and visceral. There are those who say that when looking at those shapes, feel the mind recognizing something that shouldn't exist there. It's like notice an unexpected reflection in the mirror. You know there is something familiar, but you don't know exactly why. Maybe it's because we live in an age saturated with technology, and that conditions us to see machines in any geometric pattern. Or maybe it's the opposite. Perhaps there exists in the collective unconscious a vague ancestral memory of a time in which the sky and the ground carried machines that today we call impossible. Jung would talk about technological archetypes. Others would speak of inherited memories. Abydos seems provoke both hypotheses, and when we examine the temple as a whole, we see another layer of mystery. Seti. I did not build Abydos as a military or technical monument. He built it as a spiritual sanctuary, a map of the path between life, death, and rebirth. Your runners talk about souls, not machines. Its walls are prayers, not manuals engineering. That's why those shapes clash so much. They seem like intruders in a place that should never have housed technology. And it is precisely this contradiction that makes such a powerful enigma. Nothing there should remind you of the future, but it does. Interestingly, some ancient traditions describe times before the dynasties known, eras where kings, coming from the stars, ruled the earth. These reports, however symbolic as they may be, they always arouse curiosity. Would these images have been inspired by myths much older than we suppose? They would be artistic interpretations of ideas that we no longer understand? Or would they be fragments of something that really existed and ended up being absorbed as myth over the ages? The human mind tends to personify its mysteries, but it also records more than meets the eye. At some times, myth is just the archaeology of memory. The explanation of the definition is necessary, but it does not exhaust everything. Yes, overlaps exist. Yes, erosion transforms symbols. But the question is, does this truly answer the impact do we feel? Or does it simply respond to the need to keep the past within known boxes? Because in the end, Abydos challenges more than the story, challenges our relationship with the unknown, challenge the fear of admitting that we may not know as much how much we believe. It challenges the modern arrogance of thinking that the past was always simpler than the present. Abydos is the mirror where time looks at us and smiles, like someone who knows something we don't yet understand. And as we continue walking through this temple that seems suspended between worlds, there remains a question that accompanies us like an illuminated shadow. Are we faced with an error in the stone, or a memory that humanity tried to forget? When we talk about Abydos, it's tempting to imagine that each riddle is an invitation to a greater mystery. But there is also the official reading, the interpretation constructed by archaeologists over decades of study, and it is important to understand it, not to cancel it, but to understand where the consensus touches the truth, and where it perhaps leaves empty spaces that intuition insists on filling. According to the academic view, the Abydos inscriptions are nothing more than a linguistic phenomenon known as palimpsest. Ancient Egyptians used to resculpt damaged regions, correct names royal, and replace records of previous pharaohs, creating layers of carvings that, if viewed centuries later, they can produce visual combinations that were never intended. It is a simple explanation, elegant, rational, but will it be enough? Egyptologists reinforce that the Temple of Seti II, where these forms appear, went through interventions in the reign of Ramses II. Hieroglyphs were covered, redone, realigned, letters overlapped with others, and over time erosion worked like a sculptor silent, softening contours, erasing details, creating gaps. To look at you scientific, that's enough. An old symbol added to a new symbol, worn out by millennia, would create ambiguous figures. No helicopters, no tanks, nothing machines, just coincidences. And indeed, many examples of Egyptian palimpsests show curious overlaps. This supports the argument, but something remains unsettling. When we look closely at the image of Abydos, we realize that we are not facing of a single random overlay. There are several different forms, all of them surprisingly symmetrical, all with proportions that resemble modern objects with uncomfortable precision. And here comes the most common criticism of the academic model. If explanation were just a coincidence because the shapes evoke precisely flying machines and armored vehicles, elements so specific to the modern era, by that don't evoke abstract birds, distorted boats, agricultural tools? Why inevitably seem like something that should only exist 3,000 years later? Defenders of the traditional explanation respond that the human mind is a machine of standards. We see faces in the clouds, animals in the rocks, maps in the mountains. So we would also see helicopters where there are just worn traces. They call this is pareidolia. And it's true. Our perception projects meanings. Still, this answer does not eliminate another question that echoes within those who contemplate Abydos with sincerity. Is it just projection? Or do some symbols provoke recognition because they touch deep regions of the collective unconscious, where images of humanity remain archived as psychic fossils? More conservative researchers insist that there is no record of advanced technology in ancient Egypt, nothing like machines, engines, or complex metallic structures. They remember that Egypt was a spiritual, agricultural, and architectural empire, but not industrial, and they insist that any interpretation outside of that is modern fantasy. All of this is valid. However, when we dive into Egyptian cosmology, we realize that technology, it wasn't necessarily physical, it was symbolic. The Egyptians talked about heavenly boats, spiritual crossing vehicles, solar ships carrying the pharaoh's soul to others' plans. They were metaphors, historians say. But, in the imagination of a civilization that saw the sky as an open road, could it be that such images could not have inspiration from something older, deeper, more enigmatic? Science seeks to preserve coherence. She needs evidence, dates, materials. A spirituality, on the other hand, seeks to preserve meanings. She recognizes that not everything which is true fits measurements. Abydos appears to be the place where these two languages intersect without canceling each other out. The technical explanation says, superposition of hieroglyphs. Human perception says, but why does it seem so much more than that? When two responses coexist in 10R, it is a sign that the enigma is alive. And perhaps the most curious thing is this. Even those who accept the official explanation do not. They can avoid feeling something when they look at those shapes. A nuisance, one doubt, a fascination. Because deep down, every archaeological mystery reminds us that history it is constructed not just by what we know, but by what we choose to ignore. And so Abydos leads us to a silent crossroads, where logic explains, but does not satisfy, and the question remains open, waiting for the courage to be asked new. There are moments when history seems to open like a veil lifted by the wind, and, when this happens, we don't just see the past, we see what shouldn't be there. Abydos is that moment, because despite all attempts at explanation, there are ways in the temple who continue to defy reason with almost poetic stubbornness. Among them, the famous helicopter is the symbol that most intrigues. Your lines line up precisely disconcerting. The rounded cockpit, the elongated tail, the upper rotor suggested as if someone had carved an aeronautical profile thousands of years before the idea of flight mechanic exist. Coincidence? Perhaps. But such symmetrical coincidences are often rare in archaeology, especially when repeated in the same panel. Right next to it appears a figure that many interpret as a tank or armored vehicle. It has a rectangular base, a projection equivalent to a cannon, and a structure which resembles a metallic body. Another coincidence, so some will say. However, when two modern forms emerge from ancient hieroglyphs, the gaze hesitates, and when the third comes, what many call submarine, hesitation turns into heavy silence. There, the contour seems to flow like an aquatic capsule, cylindrical shape, rounded ends, and a slight indication of a tower. There is no ancient narrative that requires such forms. There is no obvious spiritual function for them, and yet, they are there, firm, immobile, insistent. Experts say these contours are just accidental overlays, but random overlays tend to create blurs, not recognizable machines. The erosion tends to destroy, not shape symmetries, and chance tends to disperse, not repeat patterns. The question then approaches like someone walking on hot sand. Why are these symbols seem so technological? Does the modern mind design? Of course, but the projection requires visual raw material, and Abydos offers lines that evoke technology with the uncomfortable clarity. This leads us to another hypothesis, not that of real machines, but that of visual metaphors that carry lost meanings. Did the Egyptians represent spiritual concepts, using forms that we today associate with technology? They would be vehicles symbolic of the soul, representations of celestial journeys, or would echo memories of older myths, where the sky and the sea were paths taken by beings who, do they dominate forces beyond human understanding? There is yet another layer. In many Egyptian texts there is talk of solar boats, light that transported the pharaoh to the kingdom of Osiris. It was spiritual but also geometric, structured, almost technical. In some Hermetic traditions associated with Egypt, chariots of the wind, chariots of the firmament, vehicles of the eternal cycle are described. Perhaps they were not literal descriptions, but visual records of complex ideas. And maybe, at some point in history, these images crystallized into forms that today we interpret as machines. If this is true, Abydos does not show technology, but symbolic memory, and yet the feeling persists. There is something there that goes beyond the metaphor. This is where many feel the inner calling, because when contemplating forms, the mind reasons, but the heart recognizes. Recognize the mystery, recognize the strangeness, recognizes the possibility that the story is bigger than official lines claim. And if something inside you is awakening, while seeing these images, stay until the end. The answer may be here, among the silence of the stones and the restlessness of the questions that persist. Some alternative scholars claim that Abydos records technologies from a civilization forgotten, perhaps Atlantis, perhaps a pre-dynastic people. Others claim that it represents celestial visitors. Science rejects such ideas, but it does not refute them completely, only that considers it unlikely. However, when an improbability is repeated 3 times in the same wall, it stops being just improbable and becomes intriguing. And it's this intrigue that keeps Abydos alive, not like a dead temple, but like a portal suspended between ages. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how many theories there are. What matters is that, given these forms that intersect past and future, we are forced to ask, are we facing symbols, or in the face of memories that time has tried to erase? When we stopped looking at Abydos just as an archaeological record ICO and we started seeing it as a symbolic mirror, something silently changes within us. The ways that reminiscent of modern machines can be interpreted literally, it's true, but there is another lens, a deeper, more intimate, older lens, that invites us to see these images as expressions of a vast and complex, spiritual imaginary, perhaps much more sophisticated than we suppose. Because Egypt was never just stone. It was language of the soul, and each symbol was, first and foremost, a crossing. For many scholars of depth psychology, what we see in Abydos may represent archetypes in action, not common archetypes, but those linked to power, crossing, movement between worlds. Jung would speak of primordial images that arise when the unconscious attempts to translate invisible forces into understandable forms. Just like ancient people transformed thunder into gods and stars into stories, perhaps they represented the movement of the soul using forms that evoke what we today call of technology, vehicles, structures, shells that carry essence. Basically, they wouldn't be machines but metaphors for the inner journey. Imagine for a moment what it would mean to represent the passage of human consciousness through a cocoon, a vessel, or spiritual tool. For us, these shapes resemble submarines, tanks, or helicopters, because our repertoire visual is technological. But for them, perhaps they were just poetic languages to describe states of transition, the descent into the inner world, the ascent into the celestial, the crossing of the deep waters of the soul. Something similar appears in cultures different, in the solar ships of Egypt, in the chariots of fire of Semitic traditions, in the Vimanas from India, on shamanic boats that travel between dimensions. They are all vehicles symbolic. They are all moving doors. It is possible, then, that the Abydos figures do not represent real objects, but states of encoded consciousness. The cabin of the supposed helicopter could symbolize the eye that sees without seeing. The submarine's supposed turbine could be the force that drives the soul through hidden world. The armored body of the tank could express spiritual protection, the invisible armor that surrounds the initiate. These interpretations do not replace the archaeological, coexist with them, and interestingly, they can explain something that science cannot explain: why these images provoke such profound sensations in those who contemplate. Another fundamental aspect is the role of sacred imagination. In Egypt, imagining was creating, and creating was remembering. They believed that every visible form had an invisible form behind it. Thus, when the artist drew, he did not just represent the physical world. It represented what the eyes of the soul captured. And if what they saw was vast too much, they would translate into symbols that would survive time. Perhaps Abydos is precisely this, a fragmented translation of an inner vision so intense that spanned millennia. There is also the possibility that these images are echoes of visionary experiences, altered states reached by priests in deep rituals, where the limit between the visible and the invisible dissolved. In these experiments, geometric shapes become structures, lights become paths, and spiritual movement becomes vehicles symbolic. Anyone who has experienced expanded states of consciousness knows how the brain tries to give form to the unspeakable. Perhaps Abydos is the memory of someone who saw too much and tried to record the impossible. And when we think like this, another question emerges. What if these forms are not talking about lost technology, but about forgotten human capabilities? Ability to see beyond, feel beyond, remember beyond. Capabilities that still exist, but asleep. And so Abydos stops being an external mystery and becomes an internal mystery, an invitation to look not just at the walls of the temple, but at the silent walls of the own soul. As we advance through Abydos, we realize that the mystery goes beyond the walls of the temple and begins to touch deeper regions of the human mind, regions where memory, myth, and intuition intertwine like underground rivers. Maybe the riddle isn't not only in what we see, but in what we recognize without understanding. The symbols that seem helicopters and submarines can be archaeological anomalies, yes, but they can also be fragments of something bigger, echoes of stories too old to fit into books, memories that humanity carries without knowing where they came from. Carl Jung spoke about the collective unconscious as an immense archive, where experiences' primordial elements accumulate, crossing generations. Not individual memories, but legacies, psychic phenomena that are repeated in dreams, myths, and visions. According to him, separate civilizations by oceans create similar symbols because, deep down, they share the same font interior. This same unconscious could keep impressions of and forgotten times, no in the literal sense as if we had old photos in our minds, but in the emotional sense, vibrational, intuitive. Perhaps this is why unusual forms in Abydos awaken in us, the strange feeling of familiarity, not because we have already seen them with our eyes, but because we already feel them with our soul. The idea of lost civilizations may sound fantastic at first glance. However, traces of the around the world suggest that human history could be older, more complex, and more cyclical than we believe. Places like Göbekli Tepe, built more than 11,000 years ago, show that advanced societies existed much earlier than the official line of history asserts. If such ancient structures appeared unexpectedly, why not imagine that symbolic or spiritual knowledge has survived as echoes, transmitted in a fragmented way until reaching Egypt? Perhaps the priests of Abydos were recording machines, but distorted memories of original myths preserved since time immemorial. This idea gains strength when we observe recurring patterns among ancient people. A notion of celestial vehicles appears in India with the Vimanas, in Mesopotamia with the heavenly boats, in Greece with divine chariots. None of these descriptions are literal, but they all have something in common. They represent movement between dimensions. The psyche, human nature, seems to have the need to express the transcendent through forms that suggest displacement. And this leads us to a deep reflection. Perhaps the image of a helicopter or submarine carved in Abydos is just the modern version of an archetype that never ceased to exist. It is also fascinating to note how technology awakens in us a particular type of reverence. It is not just usefulness, it is a contemporary myth. It's our new symbol of power, advancement, and overcoming. When we look at Abydos and see machines, we are also projecting our own myths. And yet, this projection is not meaningless. It reveals something about the modern soul, our search for origin, for purpose, for continuity. We look to the past for a reflection of the future because we feel, intuitively, that human eras are cyclical, not linear. Thus, when we interpret the Abydos inscriptions as possible reminders of ancestral technologies, we are not just imagining. We are also trying to understand why certain symbols seem to cross time with such persistence, why they appear, disappear, and reappear in cultures separated by millennia. And perhaps the most beautiful thing is this: Abydos does not demand answers. He offers mirrors. It's the type of mystery that cannot be solved with material evidence, but with inner presence. He asks us, silently, what we remember without knowing that we remember. He invites us to consider that the human soul can carry fragments of stories that physical world has already lost. When we reach the seventh layer of this mystery, we realize that Abydos is not just asking us to choose a side, science or spirituality, coincidence or technology. He is inviting us to inhabit the space between these extremes, the place where paradoxes breathe. Perhaps it is precisely in this space that the truth is hidden, not as an absolute fact, but as a perception that changes as consciousness expands. Because if we look at inscriptions as literal technology, we stumble upon the absence of tools, engines, metal alloys, and records. But if we see them as mere hieroglyphic overlays, we ignore the extremely specific aesthetics they display. Abydos does not completely fit into either narrative. He remains on the border, that rare region where the impossible and the symbolic touch. Maybe the forms are not machines, but they are not just interferences either. Accidental. Perhaps they are symbols that have undergone metamorphoses over millennia, inheriting fragments of meanings that we no longer know how to translate. Human memory, like stone, sometimes it wears strangely. It loses details but preserves contours that defy time. And in these contours there may be messages that we haven't yet learned to decipher. Anthropology reminds us that ancient people often recorded the invisible through the visible. They carved inner experiences, visions, omens, and myths as if they were physical events. Egypt was a master at this. Each hieroglyph was a portal, not a literal description. So perhaps the shapes that look like helicopters are actually vehicles of the soul. Those that look like tanks are spiritual protections. And those who remember submarines represent descents into the inner world, not through the sea, but through the consciousness. Still, a concern remains. Why do these shapes seem so modern? Why do they so accurately evoke objects that would only exist thousands of years later? This is the point where logic falters and mystery advances. Maybe the mind, Ana, recognize patterns that cross time, or perhaps there is a larger cycle, still invisible, where ideas are repeated in different eras, like echoes that respond through the centuries. And so, before this enigmatic panel, a question rises like a shadow enlightened. We are seeing machines where they don't exist, or we are remembering something we haven't discovered yet. Abydos seems to whisper that the answer is not in stone. It's in us, and in the way how we choose to look at it. At the end of this journey through Abydos, we realize that some answers do not belong to books but to the silence that remains after the questions. Registrations, whether overlays, spiritual symbols, or echoes of forgotten memories, are still there, untouchable, challenging the look and welcoming the soul. We may never know if they represent technology out of time or just a mirror where we project what we are still looking for understand. But, in some way, each of us takes something away from this encounter. A doubt, an intuition, a memory we don't know how to name. If this journey has touched something for you, sign up and follow along with us. Sometimes the soul recognizes the path before the eyes, and in the end, Abydos leaves us with one last question, soft as an ancient wind. What if what we call the past is just the shadow of a future that has not yet, do we remember?